Welcome to the Severn River Association's first 2018 Educational Series meeting. My name is Jeff Shomig. I'm the Vice President of the Severn River Association. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here and some new faces as well, so welcome to the series. If you are new to this series and aren't already a member of the association, there's a sign-up sheet going around. Lynn has it in the back, our president. Please, we encourage you to sign it. That gets you on our newsletter. Get all sorts of interesting information, including information about our upcoming educational series meetings that we try to have about once a month. Our next one is February 20th, and that's going to be Richard Klein speaking about enforcement of various clean water, stormwater, environmental runoff laws, and so forth along the Severn River. His view of that, his view of ways that can be improved. So we look forward to that talk as well. Today we are here to talk about the Forest Conservation Act. We have some great speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. Just a little bit of background as to how we got here. The association for a long time, for those of you new to the association, Severn River Association has been around in one form or another since 1911, I believe. So it's done a fair amount of work and advocacy over the past century. But one of the things that we as a board and officers were looking at recently is how can we be more nimble, for lack of a better word, in our advocacy on issues that matter to people who live in the Severn watershed. And so over the past several months, we have created an advocacy committee, and that committee's job as it continues to form will be to do everything from testify at county council or state legislative hearings on matters important to the Severn watershed and preservation, including the Forest Conservation Act, on particular development proposals that may be of concern, and also writing to representatives, getting involved in partnering with like-minded organizations who are involved in issues such as oyster restoration that may be of interest to us and importance to the Severn River. So in forming this advocacy committee, we hope to bring in people who are not currently on the Severn River Association board or officers, or maybe who aren't even on the association itself, who are interested in this type of work. Like everything the Severn River Association does, it's based on the time that you have available to offer. We understand that we're a volunteer organization, and we try to take advantage of the talents and time people have that they feel comfortable offering in whatever advocacy issue interests them. So if you are interested in that, please contact me or Lynn after this, and we can talk about it, and we can try to get you on the committee. On this particular issue, the Forest Conservation Act, this is one of interest, particularly given the slide behind me. I remember when I first started getting interested in environmental issues, not long after college, I had learned that the Severn watershed was roughly 40% forest. And I thought, that's pretty good actually. A fairly densely populated area, roughly 40% forest, that's great. And then some years later, I learned about the Forest Conservation Act at the state level, the state law. And I thought, well, that's great too. That means that we're roughly going to stay around 40%, all as well. But then probably like many of you over the years, I've noticed, and with increasing frequency, stands of forest being bulldozed to the ground. And I was always wondering, well, maybe those are replanted somewhere, but where? I don't see any forest popping up anywhere, or saplings or anything. And as we've dug into it a little bit more, and when I say we, various environmental groups, Tom Gay, our communications director, certainly Chesapeake Bay Foundation, League of Conservation Voters, and others have dug into this. What we've learned is that the Forest Conservation Act, which was designed, one, to help protect forests, and B, to help ensure that forests that are removed for development are replaced in suitable locations, that really wasn't working out very well, and particularly not in the Severn watershed. I don't know the exact numbers, and I don't think anyone knows the exact numbers, but in poking around, I've heard that roughly in the last 2 to 3 years, the Severn watershed has lost over, or Anne Arundel County rather, has lost over 700 acres of forest, and at best people can account for maybe 16 or 17 of those acres that have been supposedly replanted. So our speakers today are going to talk about the current Forest Conservation Act, what it does, what it doesn't do, and efforts that are ongoing at the state level to strengthen that act, to close loopholes so that the now 28% of forest cover that we have remaining doesn't dwindle much more than that. So our speakers today are Rob Savage, who is alderman with the city of Annapolis, Anna Mudd, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who will be speaking to us as well, and Ben Alexandra from the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. I'm looking forward to what each of them has to say. We appreciate them coming here to talk, and during the presentation, please feel free to ask questions along the way. Thank you.
So I am recently elected alderman for Ward 7 in the city. But before that, I'm also an environmental scientist. I've worked on the Chesapeake Bay restoration for over 16 years now. And so early in my career, I actually worked as I'll tell you what this is later, but a qualified professional. So I worked as a consultant who implemented the Forest Conservation Act. And then I got a job with the city doing development review and reviewing the Forest Conservation Act on the development projects. And I've been involved as an advocate, advocating for change to the laws, and now as an alderman I get to actually make the laws. So I have a wide variety of experience here on the Forest Conservation Act. So what is the FCA? As you know, it stands for the Forest Conservation Act. It was enacted in 1991. And it's a state law, and so the municipalities and the counties, they actually have to adopt and administer that law on a local level. And they're supposed to be administered and overseen by the state, but as you'll find out, that doesn't really happen by DNR. So the intention of the FCA is to conserve forests, but not necessarily to prevent it from being cleared. But again, the intention is to protect it, to conserve it, I should say, during the development review process. And so it does have provisions that we can use to protect the forest more aggressively, and I'll get into some of those. But really, when we're talking about forests, it all comes down to water quality. That's why it's so important to protect the forest, as I'm sure many of you also are well aware. So in the Chesapeake Bay program, when we look at the Chesapeake Bay model, forest cover has the highest value in terms of nutrient reduction because they are nature's filters and nature's lungs. And that, I think, is why one of the intentions behind the Forest Conservation Act and why it was passed. So there are a number of components I wanted to go over in the Forest Conservation Act. First of all is the forest stand delineation. You may hear me refer to it as the FSD. And I do have an example I can pass around here. Oops. So the forest stand delineation basically is what it is the consultants put that together, and it basically maps the forest. It shows you what type of forest you have on a site, if there are any wetlands, or are there any streams, or steep slopes. It looks at the makeup of the different trees, the sizes of the trees, and you can actually group that. It can be really fascinating because you can group it into different stands is what they call it. And so when you do that, you also assess the health of the forest and whether or not it should get protected and what kind of status it has. So the first is a report. This is the FSD, and I'll pass this along, and you can see actually the analysis that the environmental scientists put into it. And along with that is a forest stand delineation map. And you'll see on this, they identify all the large trees and the different stands on here. So this might be interesting for you to see as well. And the other part of the important component is the Forest Conservation Plan. And I'll refer to that as the FCP. And that basically is after you map the resources, the Forest Conservation Plan basically shows how they're going to protect the forest. So it'll show the development overall with the individual stands and which ones they're going to protect. And I do have a plan. It'll basically show you what a forest conservation plan typically looks like. The other term you'll be hearing today is qualified professional, and this is something that DNR basically certifies these consultants to review and put together the FSD and the conservation plan. And so that's what I got certified as many years ago. So anybody who puts these together has to be a qualified professional. And I want to go over some of the key provisions within the FCA. And one of them, you also may hear this, is a technical manual. And I thought I had a copy. Well, there's a technical manual, which, and if you come up afterwards and take a look if you'd like, but it basically gives all the details. It's a pretty thick document about how, to the people who are putting together the plans and reviewing them, about how to actually do that. And so I'm also going to go over some of the provisions such as preservation and mitigation. Those are the two main areas that I want to focus on. So first of all, preservation. You may have heard the term priority forest. And that is a very important but often underused and overlooked provision. So in the Natural Resources Statute, coming right out of the Forest Conservation Act, it says, priority forests shall remain in an undisturbed condition. That's pretty strong language, and it says basically it should remain in undisturbed condition unless there have been reasonable efforts have been made to protect it, and that the plans cannot be reasonably altered. So again, that's a pretty strong standard, shall remain in an undisturbed condition. But I can tell you from experience with the city, most jurisdictions do not do that. They completely ignore this priority forest provision. And so priority forest is typically the sensitive areas. It's the wetlands, it's the steep slopes, the highly erodible soils, the stream riparian buffers. You have contiguous forests. And I'm going to mention contiguous forests a little bit because that's one of the important provisions. Again, something that jurisdictions often ignore, but contiguous forest, technically, it could be a small chunk of forest. It could be 10 acres on a 100-acre site, but it actually, if it connects to a large forest stand that's about 100 acres at least, then that's considered contiguous forest. So think a greenway. So think of like a greenway. I also have the county's greenway plan. I can pass that around as well. And so this can actually be used, and the county has done, this is the old greenway plan, I think it was from mid-2000s. But again, I'm not sure how well implemented that actually is. But so that can be used in the Forest Conservation Act. So I mentioned in here on the presentation about forest that's identified in local planning documents. So if a forest is identified in such as the Greenway Plan or a local planning document, anything, the comprehensive plan for the city, the general development plan for the county, that forest automatically gets a priority designation, priority forest designation. So that's why it's important to, so I mentioned the Annapolis Green Neck, or Annapolis Neck Greenway. And also any forest identified by the jurisdiction, it could be in resolution, anything like that, is automatically considered priority forest. And so one of the things they have to do, if a forest is designated as priority, the developers actually have to submit a demonstration as to why they have to clear it and why they can't protect the forest, and they have to list out everything they've done to protect it. That's a higher standard, so that has to actually be approved by city or county staff. So the developers can't claim it's a taking. So if it's priority forest, it's supposed to get protected. And so even if a developer can only build one house on their property, say it's 100 acres and they can only build one house, that's not considered a taking because they can still use the property for some economic value. But the developers, when they put together their plans, they don't consider priority forest. They just look at the zoning and say, oh, the zoning says I can build 150 homes. When it's like, no, that may not be able to happen because the priority forest could reduce that number if the staff actually implemented it.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
So it says reasonable efforts. Just looking at the plain language of the statute, that seems like a pretty easy out from the language that precedes it. So what are you say that building one house on 100 acres isn't the taking, but what are reasonable efforts? If I say, look, I want to build a hotel, I can't build it any smaller and still make money. Is that reasonable efforts?
That's an excellent point, and it's up to the local jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions, Annapolis has strengthened it a little bit, Rockville has strengthened it even more, and they actually list specific what's considered reasonable or not. So that's one area that is definitely contentious. But if you have staff that is empowered and you have a local law that is strong, you can use that aggressively. Another key provisions for preservation are specimen trees, and those are any trees that are over 30 inches. And we tried in the city to get that reduced to 24 inches, but encountered a lot of opposition from DNR, because DNR has to approve any changes you make to a local law. And they've been an incredible barrier. So specimen trees, I wanted to go into this a little bit. They're important because, I was listening to NPR a couple years ago, I believe it was. I can't remember the name of a book, but somebody who does research into fungi. And she found out that the forests are connected through their root systems, through this fungi network. And so it can be actually acres and acres that are connected, these trees. And she found out that they do communicate. They share resources, nutrients. They do communicate very basically through this network. So if a tree on the edge is disturbed, the rest of them will be impacted because of this communication. But what she also noted that the large trees, like these specimen trees, they are, and I think everybody knows this kind of intrinsically, but they are the center, the anchors for the forest. They provide that support. They help out all the trees around them. And so if you clear them, that's going to have enormous impact on the rest of the forest. So that's why they are considered, specimen trees are also kind of a priority for preservation. And you do need to get a special permission to take them out. The other provisions, so that was preservation. I want to get into mitigation, which is reforestation or replacement of the forest. And first of all, conservation threshold. I want to make an attempt to describe this for you because it's a bit of a complicated concept. All right, so the conservation threshold. Brought my tools here. All right, so picture that we have so this is going to be, so say this is a 100-acre, this is a 100-acre site, property out there. So get out my green and say, draw a line here, and this will be 80 acres of forest. So all this is forest. That makes sense. 80 acres of forest on a 100-acre site. This is not forested currently. So the threshold, for example, if it's 40%, would be right around here. And that means, so this is the threshold down here. So 40 acres. And so what it says is that if this is the threshold, the developer can clear all the way down to that threshold, that 40 acres. Well, they can clear everything, but if they go down to the 40 acres, this is one mitigation ratio. Currently, under the state law, and we changed this in Annapolis, state law, if they clear an acre forest, they only have to replace it with a quarter acre. Which is, yeah, it's not very much. So you can see how it ends up being a net loss of forest. So a quarter acre replacement for every acre removed. So if they come down to here, technically they only have to replace, that'll be 40 acre difference, so they have to take 10 acres.
And I actually have some real examples of that in Anne Arundel County right now that I'll go into my slide for in a minute. It's pretty egregious.
Yeah, it is. So 10 acre replacement under the current law. And so if they go below the threshold, it gets replaced, I forget now, I think it's like 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 forest replacement. It's a bit more aggressive. There's nothing that requires them to stay up here anywhere. It's just if they want to reduce their mitigation, they'll just clear down to here. This is what they call the break-even point. In a lot of jurisdictions, they don't consider any of the preservation stuff I just talked about. They just look at mitigation and they'll say, oh, developer, you can clear down to the break-even point. When, again, this has nothing to do with preservation. All it does is look at the mitigation rates. The first step is they need to look at what needs to be protected, and then they look at this stuff, but that's not what the jurisdictions have been doing. Oh, and another part of it, there's a reforestation credit, makes it even worse. So if they clear down to the conservation threshold, this right here, the bottom part, if they protect this, they get a credit. So in this case, they get 40 acres of credit to their mitigation, so completely wipes out their mitigation. It's a negative 30 basically. Completely wipes out. That's considered the reforestation credit.
Is that an easement?
Sorry?
Is that an easement?
Well, anything that gets protected under the Forest Conservation Act has to get placed into a conservation easement. Let's see, when the break-even point. So a similar concept is something called the afforestation threshold. So that means if we clear this out and say a site only has 20 acres of forest on it, and the afforestation threshold might be 40%, well, they have to afforest actually 20 more acres. So I hope that gives you an idea. So if you play around with these thresholds, you can actually increase the amount of forest. So the afforestation is important in areas like, North County perhaps, that don't have a lot of forest compared to some of the other parts of the county, and you can actually increase it using the afforestation threshold. So connected to all of this is the fee in lieu. The fee in lieu, so if the developer feels like they can't, or they don't want to do any of this mitigation, they pay a fee. And so this is another shocker here. The state fee hasn't been updated since '91. It's only $12,000 per acre that they have to pay. So that, and I forget the cost now, how much it costs to actually replace the forest, but anyway, it's much cheaper for them to just pay the fee in lieu. And currently it's $12,000 per acre. It's not an incentive to protect the forest at all. And so that's why, because of this, that's why the Forest Conservation Act operates at a net loss of forest. So in the city, we noticed a number of problems. The city was not allowing the forest stand delineation and the conservation plan to actually drive the development process. You're supposed to allow the forest stand delineation and where the forests are, what types they are, to actually drive the development plan. But they've not been doing that. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. So the city also failed to protect priority forests, and again, I'm speaking mostly from the city's perspective because I was in the midst of that. But I know this happens in a lot of other jurisdictions. So again, the city had no idea what the priority forest was, why it needed to get protected at all.
Is there not a standing committee?
Oops.
There's not a standing tree protection committee?
I don't know if there is for the city. She asked if there was a forest committee, conservation committee for the county.
City.
For the city. Oh, for the city, well, we do have Annapolis Environmental Commission, which helped draw these issues out and expose what was going on.
Not very empowered.
Yeah, they're not very empowered. So we also had a problem in the city. The city wasn't allowing the public to testify on any of these priority forest provisions. We would go to testify to say, hey, this forest needs to get protected for X, Y, and Z reasons, and they completely shut us down, said there wasn't any kind of process for that. And like I said, they allowed developers to clear the break-even point. Let's skip ahead here. We go to a couple case studies. One of them we had was called Parkside Preserve, also a reserve of Quietwater, some of you may have heard. And in this situation, it's right next to Quietwaters Park, and it's about what's the acreage? It's about 40 acres, I believe. And in the headwaters for the park, and there's priority forest there on the site. And this really is the case that made it apparent to us that the city wasn't following the law. They actually did give the developer permission. So the developer went through the whole process, mapped the forest, identified what needs to get protected. But he did all that at the same time. So instead of letting the actual forest design, the site should drive the direction of the design, and the design should not drive the direction of the site. But oftentimes they try to go in there and create the site they want. So the city granted them approval to clear the priority forest, and so many of people, myself included, spoke up about that. But we also had a qualified professional. Remember, those are people certified by DNR. They actually altered the data to more easily get permission from the city to clear that forest. And so I submitted a complaint to DNR saying, hey, you're supposed to be policing these consultants. I went through a large documentation. Here's how they violated the law. They committed fraud, misrepresentation. The DNR, after saying I'd get a public hearing, completely dismissed it. And they would not provide me any information through the Public Information Act. They said it's basically a black box. They're not revealing how they police these consultants. And so the problem is, and again, as somebody who worked in the city, these developers hire these pet consultants who will tell them what they want to hear and lie in many cases. And so we need to eventually get to a point where we can get these consultants driven out.
That's to get them this hard gun.
Sorry?
That's a hard gun.
It is a
Like
hard
an
gun, yeah.
expert witness report.
Yes, exactly. And so this ended up costing the city $1.5 million. And so that money could have been spent in many different areas. Yes, sir.
I don't know if it's legal, but one of the things that planners have noticed everywhere in the world, countries they've been working, is the English language being used. Parkside Reserve. Every place, when I started out as a planner in 1970 in New York City, what was interesting was the names chosen by the developer for the site implied that they're doing something that's involving the forest or preserves. And yet, that's how you know that in fact it's being bulldozed. So my question is, do you know of any case anywhere in the country where someone's attempted to police the languaging process? How you can name things the opposite of what the developer's plan is really doing?
Yeah, I don't know.
LED processors.
I agree with you. It's rather ironic when they do that.
It was a laughing matter among the planners. And since we couldn't legally go to the sample homes of the developer and say, hey, public, as they go through a sample house, there's not going to be that forest that you think is going to be next to there, because he's already submitted the plans, they're going to wipe it out. And we can't stop that. So all we could legally say was, hey, potential buyers, please talk to the planning department before you make your decisions. That's all we could say publicly. And if they came in, then we could show the plans that had already been processed.
Yeah, I saw a similar issue with the city on numerous occasions. And you'll notice I did skip over Crystal Spring. I just want to say one thing about that. As an example, the developers refused, so their pet consultant refused to listen to us and follow the law, and it took them about 6 or 8 times to actually get an approved forest end delineation, which is a record number. I've never seen them. So keep that in mind as I go over what we did in the city to fix many provisions. So we passed a no net loss light ordinance, and we did so when you look at the conservation threshold, instead of a quarter acre to an acre replacement ratio, we did that on a 1-to-1 basis. However, we were unable to get rid of the actual reforestation credit. So that's one thing I want to do coming up here in the future, is to actually get rid of that credit to make it a true no net loss. But we also did raise the conservation threshold by a few percentages and the afforestation threshold. We restricted mitigation because right now, if you clear forest, you can actually replace it out in West County or southern Maryland, and no place, not even in the watershed where you remove the forest. And so we restricted it to say that has to be done in the city, because there's another benefit to it. If we keep forest, eventually the forest is going to have a rate for nutrient reduction in the Chesapeake Bay model. So it's going to be counted towards our TMDL, our WIPs, our nutrient reduction. And so that's why if we can make sure the reforestation happens in the county and the city, we will get that credit for it. So we also raised the fee in lieu. Like I said, the state's $12,000, we raised it to $400,000 per acre. And so it's significant because it actually places it puts an economic value on the forest for one of the first times. But until we get rid of the reforestation, it's not going to be used quite as much as we would like it to. Let's see,
Pushing to actually have this spent within the jurisdiction, is that?
yes,
required now?
we pushed it to be spent on the reforest on the site, or the watershed, or within the city. And if they can't do that, then they'll have to pay into this fee in lieu, which we can use the fee in lieu. We want to, well, I'll get into that a little bit more, but we want to strengthen the fee in lieu to make sure it can be spent on acquisition, because I'd like to see that be used to actually protect forest. So we also fixed the law to say if a consultant submits 2 bad reports, we can get a completely new consultant on there. And that helps to weed out some of these bad actors. We also introduced a significant tree provision. So remember, specimen trees are 30 inches, but significant tree allows our planning and zoning to designate any tree as significant, and which gives it a higher protection value.
How did you determine bad consultant?
Well,
We couldn't hear the question.
how do you determine if it's a bad consultant? In this case, in the code, it basically says if they're denied, if they have to submit for revisions twice, then on the 3rd time we can actually request a new consultant. So it's going to be up to staff to make that determination, but also the public, who hopefully will review these reports. And another provision, this is not in the city code, but it's in the state model and many other jurisdictions. If the jurisdictions don't use the fee in lieu money, the money they get from the developer, after a number of years, it goes back to the developer. And so when you hear these jurisdictions saying they have problems using the money, where does it go after a while? That's something that needs to be addressed. So future plans, real quick. Going to remove the reforestation credit. Possibly make it so priority forests have to need a variance if you clear them. And you can also look at reducing the square footage requirement that kicks in the Forest Conservation Act. Right now it's about any project over an acre has to comply with the Forest Conservation Act, but you can reduce that. Some cities, I think it's, I think Ben might know, I think Hagerstown, I think might do it more aggressively. So this is important, this is my last slide. So I just want to give you some tips about how you can use the Forest Conservation Act to protect forest in your community. So first of all, get in there early and review the documents. Some jurisdictions are more transparent than others. The city, you can go on their permit tracking website and download these documents, but you can't do that in all jurisdictions. Some of them will tell you to submit a Public Information Act request, probably. But if you get in there early and review this, you can say, look at what they've designated as priority forest, and believe me, they do make a lot of mistakes in the, so it's good to have public eyes on this. So participate in the public process, and with priority forests, moving over that. And also look at the forest conservation plan, make sure the priority forests are being protected adequately in those plans. And then more importantly, ask to see the demonstration. Like I said, most jurisdictions probably don't ask for this, but ask them for the demonstration from the developer about why they can't keep that forest. And then challenge the approvals. We have a lot of appeal processes people don't know about. And again, some of them are more accessible than others. And remember what I said about participate in the comprehensive plan or the general development plan process, because if you get forests included in there, identified in there, they automatically have a higher preservation status if the jurisdiction actually enforces the priority forest provision. So, but it's definitely a starting point. And again, hold the qualified professionals accountable. And also there's a provision in the Forest Conservation Act, if you do find an egregious error or misrepresentation, there is a provision where the local jurisdiction can revoke approval. That's what we tried to get the city to do, but instead the last mayor decided to spend $1.5 million of program open space money instead of actually revoking it under the law. But that provision is there if you need it. And that's, with that I'll turn it over. Thank you.
While she's loading that up, can I ask you?
Yes.
How would the public be able to determine whether or not there was a priority forest or whether or not there were priority trees because you'd be trespassing on private property to get a measurement.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's helpful to have some relationships with staff to be able to see if you can get access. You can look at, these days you can look at aerial photographs, you can look at topographic maps online, and so if you see a stream, you'll know that that's a priority forest surrounding that. So around streams, 50 foot from either side of the stream is considered priority forest. Just like wetlands, non-tidal wetlands, they have a 25-foot buffer, and those are all considered priority forests.
It's probably a naive question, but you said a number of times that there's a standing law on the books that then government officials are not enforcing. And so as a random question, what's the mechanism to drive to enforce the enforcement in a sense? If the law is there and the government's not enforcing, what's the remedy for those of us in the room to say, hey guys, no, it's actually the law you need? Where's the optionality for the government?
That's a great transition. Both of them are going to deal with that. But as you can tell from my experience with the state, DNR is supposed to do that, but they don't. And so that's another problem, because what are you going to do? And the legislature says, well, why do we pass down a law if they're not even enforcing what we have in the books now? So it's difficult, but they'll definitely do more.
That's a great question. Just for introduction's sake, my name is Anna Mudd. I am the Outreach and Advocacy Manager for CBF, and this is Ben Alexandra with Maryland League of Conservation Voters. I'm really happy that Ben and Rob are here tonight. They're the policy wonks. I'm not a policy wonk. My job as the Outreach and Advocacy Manager is to mobilize and educate our members and the general public about what they can do when we see bad laws being written or good laws not being enforced. So thankfully you've gone into quite a bit of what I was going to go into, so I'm going to go skip ahead to, this is good because I wasn't very confident talking about things like the mitigation ratios and things like that, so I'm glad you went ahead and did that for me. So I thought this was a good quote. It's by Tom Horton, and it says, "We must learn to see the bay whole as water and watershed airshed inseparably linked, to see the bay as a system whose forests are every bit as much components of pollution control and environmental health as sewage treatment plants and sediment fences. It seems easy to accept spending $50 million or more on sewage treatment, but the protection or restoration of a filtering, cleansing forest is uneconomic to invest in. Forests, so vital for wildlife, clean water, and clean air, must also be seen as essential to restoring the bay and to maintaining our quality of life. We must regain the bay's natural resilience through the natural systems like forests that help the bay help itself." So we went into a little bit of this already, but I wanted to share some more examples of this ratio. Oh, real quick, Anne Arundel County, this is actually not even an up-to-date chart, but between 2009 and 2016, 682 acres were cleared, only 61 were replanted. So Anne Arundel County actually had a net loss of 621 acres because of this, this stupid formula, for lack of a better term. But I wanted to share some examples here of pictures here. Hold on one second. So in 2006, this is a development called Parkside's Executive Townhomes. It's in Hanover, Maryland, which I think is right on the northern edge of Anne Arundel County, right? So that was 2006. 2017, here's the development in its place. So you can see from the original picture, this is a large, contiguous, mature forest. And then this development went in, which for a tree hugger like me, that's sad in and of itself. But the real egregious issue we have with this development is that from the development, forest clearing permitted without mitigation 118 acres, actual forest cleared 135 acres, total replanting requirement 21 acres. So that developer was allowed to clear 114 acres without having to replant a single tree, which is where we really take issue with here with the Forest Conservation Act. Here's another good example here in Glen Burnie, Maryland. So that's the development that went into, this is 2006. This development went in 2017. And this is right in the Patapsco Tidal watershed between Marley Creek and Stony Creek. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that area, but here's what it looks like now. And you can see that little green speck right there. That's what we would consider to be priority forest, right? That's the last bit of contiguous, mature forest in this part of Anne Arundel County. And yet, developments like this were allowed to take place in it. So these are the real issues we have with the Forest Conservation Act, and this is why we want to see it fixed. Let me see here. So some of the take-home points, both from what Rob was explaining and what I showed you, is that priority forests are not being retained. Their ecologic, economic, and social value is not being reflected in the Forest Conservation Act's mitigation scheme, which was this formula here. Intact, contiguous forests continue to be fragmented, parcelized, and cleared entirely to the point where the FCA has virtually no impact on the most heavily forested sites. Local forests are critically important to local water quality and quality of life, and the Act needs to be amended to ensure that those local benefits are not being lost. So I want to get into a little bit about what you guys can do as private citizens and the Severn River Association can do as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can advocate for a cause you believe in, and I was talking to the organizers earlier this month, and they said that folks in this room, some of you have advocated for water quality issues for years, and some of you have maybe never done anything like that before. So I want to go into a little bit of the basics here. So the first thing you can do is communicate and interact with your legislators and local government. As Rob mentioned, going to these hearings, making sure that you know what's going on in your local communities is really important. But contacting your local elected representatives by phone or email is really crucial as well. This year in the Maryland General Assembly, CBF, and the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, we're going to be fighting to improve and strengthen the Forest Conservation Act. I think everybody got this handout, right? I passed them around at all the tables. So we have a bill that's filed. Is that this one? We have a bill that's filed. It should be going, we should be getting a bill number at the end of this week, and I can forward that along to your president so that they can forward that information to you. But it would be really great if you could contact your local legislators and tell them that the Forest Conservation Act is important to you and that you want to see it strengthened and improved. You can also write letters to your elected representatives encouraging them to take action and vote in favor of strengthening and improving the Forest Conservation Act. You can follow city and council agendas and attend public hearings locally or in Annapolis to speak in favor of clean water policies and initiatives. And one thing you can do that I think is not highlighted as often, but you can provide political intelligence on issues of concern to the community related to clean water. A lot of times we hear about things that are going on through phone calls to our office. And unfortunately, by the time the bulldozers show up, it's too late. And unfortunately, that's the time when most people start to notice what's going on. But if you know about a development or a piece of property that's slated for development that you think is considered priority forest, and you want to make sure that it is being mitigated properly, feel free to give our office a call and let us know what's going on so that we can work with county and city and town staff to make sure that all the rules and regulations are being followed. As Rob mentioned, relationships with county staff are sometimes really important here, and while private citizens might not have those relationships, we have those at CBF. We have a staff attorney, we have senior scientists, and you got folks like me answering the phone, so we try to do what we can. Another thing you can do is get your community involved. Writing letters to the editor of your local newspaper is really actually a great way to raise awareness about this issue. A lot of people don't realize that there is a Forest Conservation Act on the books and how flawed it really is. And just mobilizing people in your community through phone, email, and social media. I mean, I think I heard about this meeting here tonight 3 or 4 times in the last few weeks because somebody posted about it on social media. So making sure folks know that there is a hearing about the Forest Conservation Act bill coming up during this legislative session is going to be really important. And you can serve as a point of contact for your community as well. So what's your message when you're talking to legislators? I think Rob can attest that not a lot of people start their meetings with a thank you, but legislators' time is really valuable, especially during the legislative session, and especially in a political climate like this where there's a lot of negativity. Just starting off with a simple thank you can really set the tone for the meeting. So I'd encourage you guys the next time you see your legislators or your council person or your alderman to thank them for the work they're doing. And then it's really important also to share your personal connection. Ben and I, we were at a meeting in Frederick County last week, and we're advocates, professional advocates. I'm a registered lobbyist, so I can come in and talk about facts and figures all night. But when you can share a personal story about what forest loss means to you and what it means to your community, that's what really resonates with elected officials, and that's when you really start to pay attention. I think there's probably not a dry eye in the room last week when a local Frederick County mom was talking about the forest loss she had seen in her community and the impact that had on her children's mental and physical health. It's also important to educate your target. I call them the target, but they're legislators. They're people just like you and me, but we have to target our members based on what committees they're in and what leadership positions they have in the House and the Senate. But when you're educating your target, you're sharing information. They might not know about the Forest Conservation Act and its significant flaws. So that's up to you to make sure that you're educated on this issue so that you can share that education with them. And it's also really important to share follow-up information. One thing that we see a lot is people are kind of intimidated to talk to their legislators because they might not have all the answers, but it's okay to say, you know what, I don't have that answer, but Anna Mudd at CBF can find that out for you. Let me give you her card. Or I don't have that answer, but I can look up for you. Let me send this to your staffer after the meeting. So those are just some helpful tips when you see your legislators out in the community. This is a time of the year where they're out making the rounds and talking to their constituents because there is a legislative session happening right now. Finally, here's some resources for you, how to find your legislator. I can click on that. There's also an FCA action alert. I'm going to click on that real. Oh, there's no internet here. Well, if you go to our website, cbf.org, there's a Forest Conservation Act action alert. It makes it really easy to take action. All you have to do is type in your name and your address, and we already have a letter to your legislator auto-filled. So all you have to do is hit send, and that will go right directly to your legislators, letting them know that you support a strengthened and improved Forest Conservation Act. It's also really easy to find out who your legislators are. I'm sure everybody in here knows, but if you just Google really quick, who's my legislator in Maryland, there's a website that's generated by the state of Maryland. You type in your address and it tells you exactly who your legislators are so that you can contact them, and even provides email and phone information as well. And finally, I'm a resource for you, as is Ben. We're here to help you guys make your community stronger, more effective advocates, and to make sure that forest retention is a priority in the state of Maryland. And to your question, I think directly, well, what can I do when I see these laws not being enforced? I think at DNR there's one staffer, right, dedicated to the Forest Conservation Act. She's been there for a long time, and God bless her. But the big issue here is that DNR does not make this a priority. We need to make sure that they know it's a priority for us as citizens and as residents of Maryland, and hopefully that public pressure will eventually lead to a stronger Forest Conservation Act. Any questions about advocacy? Yes, sir. In the red?
In terms of advocacy, since you're talking about the Forest Conservation Act, how much, do you have any idea at all, from a physical map standpoint, how much overlap there is between the area affected by the forest versus the areas affected by open space zoning, or the critical area of the bay, which is supposed to be within 1,000 feet of the boundary of the streams? And
yeah, I have a map here. Did I pull it? Let me see.
Because if you're dealing with a given piece of parcel of land, the question is which of the three variables is maybe appropriate to try to tackle.
Yeah, great question. And for the next one, this next bill that we're really working on, what we really want to do is really better define what a priority forest is and be able to better connect between these different variables. Now, some things are already defined because they're under that, and some things we actually want to be able to use. There's like a lot of mapping data that's available, whether it's the MIMES database or other databases that show where those overlaps are between those other ones, and they should be counted as priority forests, which means we should be replacing them one-to-one or protecting them. Or are there other places where, also getting to somebody's question over here about if we can't get onto the land, how do we know whether or not this should be priority forest? Well, one of them is there's actually mapped out ecologic zones that are particularly important that the state has already mapped out. So if you can use a GIS, basically satellite layer to see where that is exactly, you can get to a lot of those questions. And so we're hoping that I'm really excited about this law because it can really help connect between some of those disparate things that have been this over here before, this over here before, this over here before, and help bring them together. So what this bill really, the major things is better defining the priority forests, making sure that if it is a priority, we better protect it. If you don't protect it, you're replanting it. For every acre you chop down, it's another acre, up to a certain amount. So we're talking like the big developers that come in, as she was showing, like plowing down hundreds of acres and whatnot. And then, of course, looking at the manual itself, that is actually directing them how to actually go about doing a lot of these things, improving that manual that they should be following, improving a lot of the language that gets to that wishy-washy stuff where why is it not enforced? Why is DNR not doing this? It's like, oh, because the language is wishy-washy enough where they can say, oh, that's a reasonable whateverness. We can slip by that. It's making it more like they have to really look at it. They have to look at it earlier in the process of the developing process. So it's not like they've already gone through all of this and then they have to check a box at the end. It's something that they should front load at the very beginning before they even start the development process to do this. So, between a bunch of those put together, it really gets to, I think, part of your question and yours. Yes?
Are there any swing votes in this county that you need particular help with?
That is a fantastic question. Are there some swing votes or particular targets that we have, particularly in this county? I would say that the Environment and Transportation Committee on the House side is a huge target. And what? McMillan is a big target. Also Speaker Bush, who is,
Yeah, I would argue that Speaker Bush is our biggest target because if he gives the green light for this to be a piece of legislation that he supports, it will very easily get out of committee. We worked on this bill actually last year. Rob, you came and spoke at our rally because Annapolis was really leading the way on fixing the Forest Conservation Act. But we really need Speaker Bush to support this, and if you live in his district, just urging him to support this bill is going to go a long way in getting it out of committee. Last year it died in committee. The E&T committee is chaired by Kumar Barve, who's a Montgomery County elected official, but I believe Earl McMillan, who's an Anne Arundel County Republican, sits on the E&T committee, and reaching out to him and just letting him know that this is a priority for you, I think it would.
Anybody on the Senate side?
Senate side, we're actually doing pretty well on the Senate side. You could always show your love and support for this on the Senate side, but it actually got out of the Senate committee last year. We have a really great leader in Chairman Conway, and we think the fight and the battle is going to be within the House of Delegates.
Is Ed O'Reilly voting the right way?
I'm not sure if he's not voted, which way he's voted, but I don't want to say we don't need his vote, but I'm just...
No, Republicans are usually a little harder this way.
Yeah, no, it is, but we have enough votes in the Senate that we're not so much concerned about him. We're more concerned about votes in the House, yeah.
However, at the end of the day, as much as we can come in with a lot of facts and figures and all the benefits of forests and all the technical things, especially on this issue, what's really going to win the day, or lose the day, is you guys, of grassroots efforts of people hearing, the elected officials hearing from their constituents that forests are important to them, that this is an important issue. So I really encourage you guys to please do that. We're going to be having a lobby day as soon as we get the bill number and the hearing date. We're going to be scheduling that in the next probably month or so. On Thursday, there's a big summit that we're having actually down at the Senate office building. There's a workshop actually that starts at 1 o'clock there that we're going to be going over like the how-to kind of boot camp and getting more into the details of this. And from 4 to 6 on Thursday, we're having a big environmental summit of a hoopla of a lot of elected officials and prominent folks in the field to be able to talk about these different issues. And it's a really big press event. It should be a lot of fun. So I encourage you to come to that too. Yes, question?
Can you tell us more about the DNR? I mean, you can change the laws and you can put all these acts in place, but what are you doing to get these guys to really operate on behalf of the people? It is one of our departments. I understand the developer's motivation, they're trying to make money, but the DNR sounds like there's still an issue. Regardless of the law that you put in place.
This is county responsibility.
They are an issue, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that they have not been as on board with this law.
I mean, why is that? Then that's their job.
Well, yeah, we had a lot of problems. When I worked for the city and we would go to the state for guidance on, because we were asking them about the priority forest provision, because we really had to read through the code for ourselves to figure out how to implement all this. And they wouldn't answer our questions. So that tells you how they don't understand the law themselves, and they're not helping their local jurisdictions. And what was I going to say? To one of the other questions, so, but the point is, though, with the DNR, they do provide this, they're supposed to provide this oversight, but it really comes down to the local jurisdiction. They have their own Forest Conservation Act they adopt locally. You can change that, you can make it stronger than the states, and so the buck will kind of stop there to a larger point. And I want to touch on something else. Somebody mentioned the critical area. So the Forest Conservation Act does not apply to anything in the critical area. So those are basically two separate laws. And We've gone over the problems with the Forest Conservation Act, and the Crickle area has its own issues. They have their own very low fee in lieu, their own mitigation issues. So that's a whole another day or night. And two other suggestions for resources. I want to just throw this out there. The Chesapeake Legal Alliance, they will work with communities, they'll find pro bono support from attorneys to support you. If you find a development that has an issue that's not following the law, they will help stand behind you and get that representation. And the last thing I wanted to say for another resource or what you can do. So the state there's training that happens around the state to basically train you to be what they call the qualified professional. Anne Arundel Community College does have that course. So if you really felt you can actually attend this course and get certified as a qualified professional, and I think that could help you when you go to the jurisdiction to advocate for certain things. But keep in mind that oftentimes the people teaching the course are teaching it incorrectly. And that's another thing that I think some of our organizations have talked about is how to address that training aspect.
So that'll kind of go with the manual, yes. The other piece of that, getting back to the, how do you make sure this kind of stuff is actually getting on the ground and happening? One of the other key provisions we really want in the new law is right now they can get out of it by saying, well, we'll just do a fee in lieu, and then, that also becomes this problem with, okay, DNR can just say, oh, just do the fee in lieu, don't do this other piece. So then this fee in lieu where, oh, you can't do it, you have to pay it into this fund, that money ends up just piling up in a lot of counties, not being used, and sometimes just being reabsorbed back into to the state or general fund or whatnot. So one of the key provisions we're trying to do in this new act is actually make sure that money really gets used so they can team up to do grants, to work with other nonprofit organizations, maybe like Severn River Association, etc., to really get projects in the ground and really get moving. And enforcement in some ways will be a problem, but in other ways you can also tighten a lot of the language so that it's much easier. If they're really not enforcing it, you can really hold them accountable to that. And I think that's a really important piece that we're really trying to hope to fix with this new Forest Conservation Act that we're pretty excited about.
Ms. Mudd, you talked about educating the target.
Mm-hmm.
Does CBF have resources to help in general over the course of a year to train us better to educate the targets?
JP, that's a great question. John Page and I were colleagues at CBF, so he was just setting me up there. But we offer a voices course at CBF. Every fall we host a class. It's a 6-week course, and we essentially train people to be better advocates for their community on all environmental issues. This past year, Frederick County has been a big target of ours. They're losing forests at a really high rate. So we moved the class to Frederick County, but we're going to be bringing it back to Annapolis in October. The registration opens up in August. We sell out every year, so I'd encourage you guys, if you're interested, to look at our website in August. I can also send out an email with the link in it once that comes about. But it's a 6-week course. It's 2 hours. We have experts come from all over the state to teach you how to be better advocates, both in forest conservation and water quality, and oyster restoration, and ag preservation, all of that stuff.
The name of that course again?
It's called Voices. It's volunteers as Chesapeake stewards. That's what it stands for. But it's essentially teaching individuals how to have a more effective voice in Maryland.
And also for helping to train on Thursday. Again, I would encourage you to come to that workshop at 1. Another thing I actually brought with me as a little educational tool right here is actually what we're probably most well known for at the Maryland League of Conservation Voters that I'll pass out in a moment, is this environmental scorecard where we actually score elected officials, state level elected officials on key environmental votes and hold them accountable. And so we can help educate voters like you guys and get better pro-environment candidates in. If they're not, help get somebody else that is better in there, etc. So I really encourage you guys to grab this, keep it up. It's also available on our website and can really help you when you're about to go into that voting booth. Let's pass this out.
Before the voting booth, write a check to the candidate who will get rid of the worst offenders or is one of the good guys. I think that's more and more important, because the developers are the guys who write the checks. That's who it gets listened to. Write your own check, then you'll get listened to.
As an elected official, I really appreciate that.
Yes, sir, way in the back.
This is a question kind of city level. What's sort of Gavin Buckley's stance on increasing the Forest Conservation Act in Annapolis specifically? What have you seen in the past few weeks, really?
Well, fortunately, he's largely ceded to me in terms of following my lead in terms of environmental initiatives, and I'm not going to argue with that. I think so. I have plenty of initiatives I'm going to lead with, and he's already told me he's very supportive, and we do have him saying that he wants to actually pass a true no-no-loss ordinance for the city. So yeah, I'm very excited about the potential we have here in the future. We have a number of other elected officials, aldermen, who are supportive of the environment.
To frame the whole legal issue, both the EPA and NIFWIF believe that it's the state's responsibility to enforce. The states in turn believe that it's their local jurisdictions who enforce the laws that they produce. And they're, in fact, the city has been in the process of creating its own interpretation of the forest law. It has to enforce it, and they only come down and get involved if they think there's been an egregious discrepancy from the laws they've passed. So if you're going to spend your time, spend it on your local officials, because they're the ones who have to enforce these laws. It doesn't go up the ladder.
Yeah, somebody in the back, another question?
Yeah, you've all talked a lot about what could and what should be in there. Can you give us one thing to chew on tonight that you're really, really excited about in the new bill coming out this week?
I would say I'm very excited that priority forest is going to be more clearly defined. Right now, there's a lot of ambiguity. Sorry, I got tongue-tied.
I think that having a 1-to-1 ratio, replacing hate on these big developers, if it's in an area that's our best forest, are the ones that, and those are the ones that we're losing in Maryland. If you chop down an acre, you have to replant an acre. So that does two things. One, it makes sure that we're not losing forests and we're replanting, and two, it makes them think again before they go into that in the first place. Hey, maybe I'll go redevelop this existing town or city, that we should be investing there in any ways rather than sprawling out into the, into these forests. So that 1-to-1 ratio I'm really excited about.
I say I'm excited just by the interest around this act, because if people like you aren't speaking up, then these laws would continue not to be applied or implemented correctly. Because again, we can get everything we want adopted, but unless people are actually holding, I'll say, politicians like myself accountable, it's not going to happen. So, thank you.
Well, isn't the replanting a joke to begin with? Because you're taking out a forest and you're putting in a pine plantation.
Yeah, and I would say that the purpose of the bill this year is more focused on forest retention. Last year, we really tried to fight for a 1-to-1. For every tree you cut down, you had to replant a tree. And this year, we're really focused on, we've learned from our mistakes from last year, and we're really focused on more on forest retention, because you're right, the trees that you plant to replace mature forests and these specimen trees, it's just, they're not equal.
Yeah, and I think CDF may have done some studies that majority of the time these mitigations end up failing. They don't work. So that's why the emphasis has to be placed on the preservation and these priority forests and not the mitigation.
The other part that's really misleading is, even if you wanted to plant the trees, you don't have the land to plant them on. And this is, you just can't make land. I think what the priority should be, and it's like after the horse has left the barn here, is to go back and look at these subdivisions that have been approved and find out where they tiptoed on the rules and regulations, and go after all those people down that train that purposely stepped on those rules and stretched them out and make them accountable for their past performances.
So great point. For those that didn't hear, we're actually collecting a lot of those examples right now. If anyone here has any of them, we'd really love to know. Examples where big developers have gone in and plowed down a lot of forests before and have stomped on the existing rules. And so we can better see and better display and showcase not just the numbers of oh hey, since this bill was in there throughout Maryland, we've lost about 100,000 acres, and we're slated to lose probably another 35,000 by the year 2025. But rather, hey, here's this real example that you can see and feel and touch that will really help us when we're having this new one where they won't be able to do that so much.
Another, I want to say something about that though, because I think there is more space than people realize out there. Because we had to, when we were dealing with this in the city about having the no-no loss, people say, well, is there even space? And when we looked at the latest data there is, one of the things you have to factor in there is the developers they're holding on to property that they want to develop. But if you raise the fee in lieu, which is what we did to have almost $500,000 per acre, that means that they're going to want to do the mitigation because it's going to cost them more money to protect the forest. It's going to cost them more money to clear the forest. So they're going to want to do that kind of mitigation versus just paying into this bank. And so I think that has to be a part of it if you want to get, and I agree with where you're trying to go with that.
Yeah, and I agree, and that's something that we hear from the developers all the time, like, oh, we're going to run out of land, which is ridiculous, unless they're saying that every single, do you want to plow the entire state? It's just going to be one big parking lot? I don't think that's reasonable. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of opportunities we can do this. It's also, as you fix these, there's opportunities for other folks that want to do, like forest banking, mitigation banking. Hey, I can start planting and reforesting my land and getting paid for that kind of thing too. So there's a whole lot of opportunities. So I think that just saying we'll run out of land excuse is a fallacy.
One more.
One more. Yes, sir, you've had your hand up a while.
Simple question. Where's our lawyers, Dan? And what about statute of limitations? How far back if we figure somebody did something 5 years ago, can't really do anything?
Yeah, and the truth is that this law, they're not necessarily breaking the law. That's why we're working to strengthen it. I mean, all the developers, the examples I showed you up there, nobody broke any laws, right? It's just them taking full advantage of the loopholes within the law, which is why passing this law this year in Annapolis is so crucial.
Fine, thank you.
Yeah.
No. No, absolutely wrong. I think what I pointed out before about the bad consultants, that's where the train falls off the track.
Yeah.
It falls off right there when you pay somebody $500 an hour to sit and try to tell the Board of Appeals their position and knowing full well that these guys are hired.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you there, but what I'm saying is that isn't necessarily illegal in the current state. It's illegal here now in Annapolis because if these consultants write the bad reports.
I think it's arguable. I mean, because I disagree a little bit because I do think you can make the case that they've broken the law. I mean, the law clearly says they shall be preserved and remain in an undisturbed condition. And I can guarantee you that most of these jurisdictions are not even asking for this, again, the demonstration about why they can't protect these forests. That is a violation of the law. If they're allowing the development design to go forward without even considering the priority forest, that is breaking the law. But one thing I want to mention with the law, there's the Environmental Standing Act. I can't recall when it was adopted, but that's a Maryland Act. And there's very, very little case law on that. And basically what it says that if anybody lives in a jurisdiction and is impacted by this law, an environmental law, they automatically have standing. So if we can get a good case, so you don't necessarily have to be like 100 feet away or 1,000 feet away, whatever they're saying, if we get some good case law on this act.
And two other pieces on that. Number one is that right now with the enforcement, it's saying if you don't do this right, okay, what's the enforcement action? It actually does say that, and a lot of times it says, oh, the state will come in and take over the county's program. The state doesn't want to do that. The state does not have the staffing to do that. They don't have, they're just not going to. So under the old law, it's that, okay, they broke it. Okay, what does it say is the punishment? Oh, well, you know, that's not going to happen. So that's one of the things we're really trying to change. And the second part is on this idea of, oh, you can just get a hired gun, as you said, to come in and say that, oh, this is not priority forest. Well, if we get this one changed, it's then going to be, okay, is this an ecological zone, which is mapped, and oh, wait, no, you're in that mapped area that is, how are you going to fool a satellite, right? Like, that's not the same as saying, oh, this is not, we have this little wiggle or that little wiggle. So it's going to be a much different, hopefully a much different situation in that regard.
So, just following up on the standing comment you made, so is there a citizen suit provision or something similar to that in the proposed legislation?
In the proposed legislation?
Yeah.
Any question?
No.
No, I don't think we're changing that standing thing. There is some other things that we might be going forward on standing issues and such like that. Just as enforcement as a general whole is something that we're collecting a lot more data on, trying to get another, bills and stuff like that we're working on. That's a whole other issue though for a whole other day, so not in this one.
It's really up to the local jurisdiction. They also have their own standing standards. Because that's what we did with the city of Annapolis, although the case was still ultimately dismissed, but that's a whole other story. That answers your question. So that's it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I'll take the MC's prerogative for a closing statement and one last question, general questions. The closing statement is, I think it relates to a question about how do we get the DNR to enforce the law? How do we get politicians to be interested in this law? And I think many of you, those of you who live in Arnold or Severna Park, are very familiar with this. I know my son has a friend who lives in a neighborhood behind the Safeway in Arnold. And for years, they've gone and played in the woods with trees that were, not much smaller than some of these tables. And there was, I've never been back there, but he described it to me. There was a stream, there was a little pond with frogs and so forth, and then he watched the whole thing get bulldozed, literally bulldozed like you would see in these pictures of the Amazon rainforest where they clear cut for agriculture. And actually his friend described during the day how at times their house would shake when some of the bigger trees would fall down. That's how big the trees were that were being bulldozed, completely cleared. And it's a sad story when you think about, 12-year-old not being able to hike in the woods anymore. But I think inadvertently the people who have cleared this woods may have done more for support of the Forest Conservation Act and similar forest conservation measures than just about anyone else could do, because I hear constantly people talk about that as they drive down Route 2. How did this happen? How did what was once a forest be completely paved over, completely bulldozed, and then you have a community of townhomes or homes, whatever, just pop up there? That was one of our last forests, and if we can't even save that, what can we save? And so I talked to a number of folks who are running for county council, running for the General Assembly, and they, from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and the common thread among all of those people that I've spoken to is you would not believe how enraged people are right now about the perceived, and I would say actual, overdevelopment in the county. It's people sitting in traffic, seeing a woods bulldozed and knowing that that's going to be more traffic for them to sit in. It's people who moved here with the expectation that the area would have a certain character, and seeing that character radically altered and wondering why they moved out here, why they have a long commute. So I think getting people involved, this sort of grassroots, not to beat a dead horse, but I think that's critical. Without that thrust, without people grabbing the politicians and the policymakers by the collar and saying, this matters to us and this needs to stop and these laws need to be strengthened and enforced, it's not going to change. But if that does happen, that's how you get the change. Sorry.
Yeah, but you realize the problem is those of us who live in that area have, in terms of the county. We're in District 5.
I can imagine many problems.
No, seriously. We're in District 5.
Right.
Well, that answers the question.
Well, it answers the question about getting involved and having people who are elected or convincing the people who are elected to enforce these laws. At the end of the day, it's force and public pressure. The second comment I have, and this is the question, is going to lead to a question. We're talking about preserving forests. I know that where I live on my property, we have about 27 trees spread over a little less than 2 acres. That's not a forest, but it's heavily treed. Our neighbors are roughly the same, and then next to us we have about a 3 or 4 acre forest. But the forest-specific wildlife you have in that heavily treed suburban environment is incredible. You have hawk species that only live in deep woods and deep forests. They have shorter wings than the hawk species that glide around. You have wild turkeys. Those of you who are here for the bird presentation saw a picture of the big wild turkey that walks through our yard. It provides energy efficiency. It cools the house, it cools the area. It's a big difference between, we used to live in a townhome community where it was like Death Valley when you'd walk out. The temperature now is easily 5, 6, 7 degrees less in the summer. So my question is there any effort being undertaken right now, if not to conserve as a priority forest type of thing, to incentivize homeowners to retain this type of suburban tree canopy that we have in the area? That's a question for any of the speakers who are here.
Well, in Arnold County, this is one good thing they did. They have freed up the fee in lieu money to be given to homeowners as an incentive to put their property under a conservation easement, which means they get tax breaks from the conservation easement and they can't clear the forest in perpetuity. So that's one incentive I'm aware of.
The county provides free trees to the homeowners.
To plant the trees.
Plant the trees on their property.
Okay. Great.
Is there any priority forest on the Brownsville Hospital Center that they plan on bulldozing everything that's complex?
It's probably most of it. It's probably all part of forest. Because remember, if it's connected to a forest that's larger than 100 acres, which that site alone is over 100 acres, then it's automatically priority forest. And they do that again because there are certain wildlife benefits to having a contiguous forest, especially if it's, think about contiguous forest along a stream bed. It has, or a stream itself, it has many beneficial things to it.
There's an easement on over half of the property.
Yeah, there may be already, yeah.
Which aggravates the developers.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, terrific. Thanks again for coming out. It's great to see all of you. Remember to sign up sheet.